All right. Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us today on our webinar on quality through security in an AI-driven era. My name's Hayley Menzies. I'm Product Marketing Manager at Kiuwan and Preemptive, and I'm excited to introduce today's session. Chris Feralia is a seasoned software engineer and technical product manager with expertise in QA and testing across regulated industries like nuclear power and healthcare. And our second expert in today's session, John Bronner. John is a software development expert with a strong background in .NET and Java. He has held roles in infrastructure development, sales engineering, and director of support. Currently, he is a solution architect for the DevSecOps brands at Sembi. And with that, I'll hand it over to Chris and John to kick us off for today's session.
Thank you, Haley. And as always, I think it's our second webinar together. Thanks, John, for joining and coming together across our Sembi products. So really excited for this one. So I think we'll just go ahead and get it kicked off. So we'll start with this concept, kind of the shift left imperative. So one of the things I'll kind of talk about mainly, coming from the TestRail and my testing background, is security really traditionally was not part of software testing and QA. For those in the webinar, I'm sure you're thinking about this. Maybe you fall more on the test side versus security focused roles. But software testing traditionally is focused on functionality. It was treated as a separate discipline related to application hardening, security posture. It was really a segregated thing. And it was really more reactive even than proactive a lot of times, right? It was late in the cycle. At least that's when I saw it. I don't know, John, I mean, you have a lot of experience in the security side. This really aligns, right? I mean, security was always the not afterthought, but hey, before we release, we'll scan it, or the QA guys aren't doing this, right? I mean, what's your
Yeah, I mean that traditionally that's just been the way it's been. Security was a stamp you put on your product before you push it out the door. It's as we'll kind of talk about throughout the course of the webinar, that's changed recently. It's been a good trend we've seen, but historically, traditionally, security was something that we did at the end before releasing to production. It was not something we thought about throughout.
And then to round this out, this kind of concept here of security not being part of actually the software testing lifecycle, or even something that falls into the role of either a software tester, quality engineer, test engineer, is really more siloed accountability, right? I mean, again, we're seeing that change now. This is the shift left imperative that we're talking about. But developers really, what would they do? They would ship features, developers would validate the quality and test against them, and then security was the security guy's problem, or we have another team that does that, right? It's really more of this handoff. And the last thing around really it compounds that is this idea of speed over resiliency, where I mean there's a lot of pressure to release, right? AI is one of the big things driving that. We'll talk about how AI is influenced, like why are these concepts that John and I are talking about important? Well, speed over resilience, I mean, a lot of times team would just skip this, right? We've seen this, and I know John advocates for it. I've mentioned it. We're doing webinars like this across, the Sembi brands and both our customer base and the community, that people may skip security validation or look at it as not part of software quality, which it really is. Leading into that, I think it's a good segue, and I know John has some thoughts, and we'll talk about this. This is from our TestRail software testing quality report. This is a free report that we do an annual poll of several thousand both TestRail customers and testers across the industry every year. And one of the big polls we did, and I thought it was valid for this one, and John and I had some great discussion whenever we pulled it for this. So what roles are involved in security testing across, I think we did like 2,000 or 3,000 people for this poll. And the number one role, the number one actual response here was 35% of the people said we don't really have a dedicated security specialist, right? And that's like pretty shocking, Other roles are scattered in mixed responses between DevOps. Maybe you have a pen tester, maybe you have a cybersecurity specialist or security analyst, and it kind of rolls up. Does this surprise you, John, from what you see? I mean, 35% of the people said like they have nobody or they don't even identify that, right?
No, and kind of like, harkening back a little bit to the previous concept we brought up, is like, well, we're typically historically there's variations on this, but we're not making money for our company by adding as much security as we can. We're making that money by putting out the latest features and functionality that our customers want. And so just, it's something that, again, just on that idea of being more reactive, it's like, oh no, we had this breach. Oh no, we had this incident. So it's become more of a reactive thing. But yeah, I mean, basically what we see in working with our customers, our user base, is this is typically a function of the size and the maturity of the organization security wise. So as much as I'd love that every company that we work with has their own SOC or their own red team, blue team, they're doing all these things, all the right things. It's probably not the case. And what we've seen, just a rule of thumb, is typically 100 developers, software developers, to every one security person. And when we get into the bigger size organizations, sometimes that gets a little out of hand with it. Sometimes we're talking 200 to 1, 300 to 1. So again, the problem set that we're facing keeps growing. Security keeps growing as a problem, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're getting headcount. And so a lot of that means we do have to share the responsibilities, and we do have to rely on good quality tooling to help us, because it's just such a big issue that we're dealing with and constantly evolving.
Yeah, and I think AI is going to make it worse, and we'll talk about tooling here next. And I think it's interesting, just exactly what you mentioned, John, is it's everybody's issue, right? It's an impact on quality, just not I'm the person that runs a scan, where do they go, how does this fit into a process? So I think this is another interesting, again, this is from our TestRail software testing quality report. What type of tooling are you using related to security inside of the QA process? And I think this is also an interesting one. They talk generically about some pen testing tools, makes up 30%, vulnerability scanners, some cloud scanning. Within our top four, we talk about SAST, which will be one of the focuses today. And I think that's one of the most important for, I'll call it kind of crossover quality, using quality and security as a combined or unified model. And then we have obviously like some container scanning, fuzz testing, some SCA tools. I know you'll get into more of this, John, but I don't know. One of the things I think that one of the top four tools here being SAST, I know that's really important. Talk really quickly about how that can be done really early. I just want you to mention that. I know we've talked about it before, where that's something that the tool doesn't, we don't have to be at time of release to start doing SAST as a focus, right?
Yeah, well, that's why we love SAST and even SCA for that matter, is a lot of the tooling, penetration scanners, penetration testing tools, DAST, dynamic application security testing, even fuzz testing, that requires us to build and deploy our software. So when we're talking about shifting left, if we're trying to engage and apply security measures as soon as possible, with SAST, we can have 10 lines of code. We could be 100 lines of code, and we could start scanning and start getting those feedback loops going right away. With a lot of the other tools that we have in our polling here, they're all valid tools. There's nothing. I mean, I love Metasploit framework and some of the other pen testing tools that are available to the community. But again, the issue with a lot of those is it has to be building. We have to compile it. We have to have an environment, a staging environment set up. Maybe we have to have our Terraform script. For all these things have to happen, which involves a lot of other steps, and we got to involve our infrastructure, our DevOps people, to get something that's running in order to do that kind of testing. And by then it might already be too late. So SAST and even SCA, which is scanning all those dependencies, those third-party tooling, the third-party dependencies that we have, we can do that as much earlier in the process for our teams.
Yeah, and I think that's this whole idea of shift left imperative. So no, thanks for talking about that, John. And I think people lose that, right? So it's really interesting that we're using some of the right tools, maybe not unifying them, or maybe not having dedicated people to identify them. And again, that's one of the takeaways for today. So really good insights. And this really kind of brings us to this next area. And I know John and I, again, have talked about this in a while. And again, there may be still people in this call like, well, I'm interested for security. I'm kind of curious on how AI is going to impact things. The reality is that AI is just making an existing problem even more rapid and prolific, right? And, again, kind of work cross-cutting in the brand, just like John does. John's more of the security guy. I'm more in the test tools and QA space. But everybody remembers a lot of these events that have been around, even the past few years, like the Log4j, Log4Shell library issue, where basically allowed remote code execution, the Capital One misconfiguration, where leaked tons of customer records. Even going back to 2014, everybody remembers the SSL or Heartbleed if you're around or in the industry then. That was a big deal. So all these things, although they're security issues, are actually quality problems, right? These created, not hundreds, thousands, tens of hundreds of thousands of applications, products, things to be re-released, dependencies to be changed, version upgrades, massive impact on end user quality through security. Just any thoughts on this, John? I think that it's a big deal that whether it's a bug for a vulnerability or a functional issue, it's really the same thing, right? I think that's where people get that kind of like skewed.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's again, we can't just think about these things as security issues because they're impacting our entire business. So I remember a lot of these firsthand, to be honest with you. And a couple of points about these is we talk about defense in depth. So the Capital One issue, it was a misconfigured application firewall. But we also had a server-side request forgery, which is a vulnerability in code. So if we had caught that earlier in the process, it wouldn't have mattered that we had a misconfigured firewall, or these things happen again because of speed. Like, we're probably taking the defaults for our firewall. We might not have ratcheted it down the way we need to. But if we have that defense in depth, if we caught this earlier, you know what? We caught that SSRF issue with our SAST scan. Hey, I created a bug ticket for my dev, assigned it out. She fixed it in her next sprint, gone. This issue never happens. We do rely on defense in depth, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but as much as we can do beforehand. The other issues are more related to our software supply chain, those third-party dependencies. And I remember the Log4Shell because I was working at a Kiuwan at the time, and we had customers ask us, well, the great news is the way Kiuwan works. I remember Log4j, they came out with, I believe, 5 patches in a 2-week period to address this. And the cool thing about a SAST tool is as soon as that patch is out there, you'll know about it through Kiuwan. So and the same goes with the Heartbleed and Equifax bugs being configuration and/or issues with OpenSSL. Those are issues with your third party, your software supply chain. So again, when we're talking about scanning, we can't just look at our code, the code we're building. That's maybe 20% of the picture. This package, this MSI, this installer that I deploy is probably up to 80% third party dependencies. So again, the sooner we can address these issues, the better off we are. And then we still have the defense in depth so that, hey, if one of those things happens to fail, the other security measure that we took will take hold and we can deal with it at that point. So.
Yeah, and I think these are really good to drive home. I know kind of spend a few minutes kind of talking about some. If you're not familiar with these, we'll have the slides and the details available. Take a look. I think it's a good exercise to understand where we're really at risk here. So yeah, good stuff, John. So we'll kind of move to this concept, and I'll give John credit for this. We were talking, we were kind of preparing material. This idea, and John was saying, well, we really have to get to safer safe software, safer software sooner. And I'm like, man, that's really a great way to think about how not only shift left from the test SDLC side, but also now thinking about security of we have to get to safer software sooner. And that's really the idea that we'll kind of talk about now of how to do that and some challenges too. So I'll let you take this away, John. This is kind of, I think, a great picture. I always like looking at this of how all this plays together around DevSecOps, because that's probably different or could be new to some people in the call that are maybe more familiar with the software testing side or SDLC general process. Talk about this DevSecOps. How does all this work together,
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no. DevSecOps, development, security, and operations, the main sort of thrust, the main goal is that we're about integrating security into all phases of the software development lifecycle. So I'm sure we've all heard of DevOps. That's just, all these sort of concepts as far as, how to build those feedback loops and get the software out quickly and efficiently. We're working together with our operations team. DevSecOps is a concept that came a little bit after DevOps, and it's about, gee, we need to overlay our dev process with security. So we're enabling secure software from the start, rather than trying to apply those security measures at an end. And the other thing is we have to do this without sacrificing speed and time to delivery. I can't just come to our dev team and say, hey, you know what? We've got 500 new vulnerabilities. Let's just stop progress for 6 months while we address all these. So we have to take all this into account with DevSecOps. So how do we do that? Let's start at the start. What are we building? That's where the risk assessment and threat modeling comes in. So with risk assessment, do we have to worry about a nation state attack on this? Do we have to worry about hacktivism? We work with customers in that realm, or are we more just concerned about keeping our customers' data safe and secure? Is that the issue? Threat modeling. Am I building a mobile app? Or am I building a desktop app? Am I maintaining a legacy desktop app? Do I have a web, do I have APIs that are exposed, microservices, things like that? These are all just questions that we can ask our team and say, hey, let's start thinking about these things at the start so we can architect a secure application. So again, just starting at the start, if we think about, things like with a mobile app, we can think about things like, well, where's our data stored? If we're storing it client side, then we have to apply some pretty good encryption. We have to be mindful of where we're storing our data. Can we use shared preferences, things like that? No, we probably don't want to. But if we're thinking about, the point is, if we're thinking about that at the start, then we could sort of like make some architectural decisions around what we're doing without having to worry about that stuff at the end. And then we flow through the process of writing secure code. Again, if we know what we're doing, we can write code in such a way that it will be secure. We can take those things into account. So we're talking about AI generated code. They don't necessarily have all this context if they're spitting out 50 lines of code for you. So we do, because we're thinking about the business. We're thinking about the impact to the customers. We're thinking about the impact to our shareholders and stakeholders, all that stuff. We think about that stuff. SAST and SEA, again, very early in the process of scanning the code and relying on the tooling a little bit more. Like, we try and educate ourselves as much as possible as quality engineers, as developers, as DevOps persons, but we still need to rely on that tooling. And then obviously bringing in pen tests and secure coding reviews, that's an independent view. So we're incorporating that. And then once we shift to the right-hand side of the screen, that's where we're looking at, once we get into production, how do we defend and how do we monitor? How do we keep an eye on the things that we've pushed out in production? How do we know if a breach has happened? How do we know? So DevSecOps is really all about incorporating security into all phases of the software development lifecycle. It's about enabling secure software from the start. So we talk about like planning and how to carry out building secure apps. How do we do that all along? And then also shared responsibility. So like we talked about, the problem of creating and deploying secure software so that we keep our organization safe, we keep not just our software, but our organization. We're protecting our organization, and we're protecting our customers and their data. This is something that we cannot just do by ourselves. If we've got a team of 100 devs and we've got 2 people focused on security, that's too big of a job. And the threat landscape is constantly evolving. There's constantly new tooling. It's a cat and mouse game. There's constantly new things out there. So we do depend on the security champions within our org. That being said, we have accountable people. So if we get DDoSed or something, we can't be looking around and saying, oh, who's going to fix this? Or if we get attacked, we can't be looking around and trying to figure that out at the end. We've already done that at the beginning. But in order to carry this out and keep our org safe, we do rely on everybody doing a little bit of their part. And, like I said, everybody can contribute in their own way by just simply bringing up what they're doing in their day-to-day. Like, hey, did you know that we have to build up these, like the another thing is inventory. We're dealing with things like phantom APIs. Some people might not know the full inventory or the full purview of their app landscape. We might not know that, so it's hard to lock that down. So everybody can do their part, but again, that's sort of the gist of DevSecOps.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really good, John. And one thing I just want to mention, specifically for this is the one area in the middle, and just before we go on, yeah, it is in the middle of this for those that are on the call and they're thinking on the webinar today, and they're like, well, I'm more of a QA test focused. I write a lot of automation. Maybe I do some manual testing. Maybe I do both, or I even lead teams. The biggest part of DevSecOps, or one of the biggest cross-cutting parts, right in the middle there, is testing, right? Like that's one of my big things where, you think DevSecOps, you think, well, I'm a cybersecurity analyst or a compliance and risk officer or something. Right in the heart of DevSecOps is testing. So I just think if everybody's not aware of that, I think that's a big takeaway, like what John was saying. And it really hit me is like, we really have to embed and think about not how we preparing or leveraging tooling or process, but testing actually is right at the heart of this, actually. But no, this was really good, John. I think this was hopefully that gave some insights for the audience. And I guess around threats, we had a couple other, I think a while ago, for those that maybe in the TestRail side that have seen some of my webinar content around regulated industries. I previously talked about OWASP Top 10 and how we do functional testing that focuses on security vulnerabilities, right? So functional focused testing for security. Talk about the OWASP Top 10, John, for those that may not have attended that last year or is not as familiar. Just what are some of these threats? Like, how should we even be aware of them? Or this may be some of the things coming out of SAST tools, like, right, some of our findings may align with this. So maybe just give everybody just a few minutes of like what the OWASP Top 10 is. Why should we care about it?
Sure, yeah, no, OWASP is the Open Worldwide Application Security Project. And they're a not-for-profit, and their big sort of thrust is to provide guidance for creating secure software. So they're open source. Their whole role is providing education to the community. It's open source, and that's the gist of it. And probably around 20 years ago, they've been around for 20 years, give or take. They started coming out with the OWASP Top 10, which is they curate and they will stank rank in order from their experience the top vulnerabilities and exploits that are in the field. So, and back in the day, 20 years ago, it was only web applications. We were only dealing with web applications. And nowadays, there's an OWASP Top 10 for mobile. There's OWASP Top 10 for API. And they've recently, just this year, come out with OWASP Top 10 for LLM applications. So when we talk about the breadth of the problem set that we're dealing with, there are, just last year alone, there were over 40,000 CVEs published. That's common vulnerabilities and exposures. And these are publicly disclosed vulnerabilities that are maintained and curated again by the MITRE Corp and CVE. But just to give you an idea, when CVE started publishing the CVE for the years, they were around 800, 900, 1,000. And last year they had 40,000, over 40,000 were published. And this year we already almost have 40,000. So any one individual, any org or whatever who even focused on that can't keep up. So relying on the OWASP. So if I know very little about app security, if I know very little about the space, then I can go to something like the OWASP Top 10 and I can figure out what does improper platform usage mean. So again, I believe this is actually the mobile Top 10 now that I look at this. The improper platform usage, insecure data storage, those would be things like, how am I caching my data client side? If I don't do it properly, then I could just simply hook up the emulator and I could see the data right there. I might be able to get to, I might get your API key right there from within the client side storage. Insecure communication. Am I applying the latest TLS, or is that something that can be cracked? Things like that. But again, just taking the problem set and shrinking it into something that's easily digestible. That's what the OWASP Top 10 will do for us. And again, it's open source, so I would encourage anybody to not only take from it, but if you can give back. It's just my little plug. So
Here's my question, I guess, John. So for those in the call, so again, if coming from the QA side, or if you don't really fill a test focused role right now, but you're in the role of software quality, right? I mean, like I looked at this, and when I led QA teams, this was something we factored in. I've kind of always been like a security kind of focused, QE, QA in my test roles, but a lot of teams are not, or may not have awareness. Like, for example, insufficient cryptography or some of these findings, right? These are potentially detailed code patterns. How do we really identify this, right? That would be my next thing, is like, what are we going to do? Is this SAST scanning? Is that how that fits in, right? SAST is going to find these for us. Like,
yeah,
we
yeah,
don't have to have knowledge about this to identify these, in addition to everything else that we need to do, right?
yeah, and that's a great point. So we'll get into a little bit in the demo later, but yeah, it's probably not realistic to expect that anyone, myself included, would comb through 100,000 lines of code of our code base and find insecure cryptography manually. That's not realistic. It's one thing to educate yourself, what we would always encourage, but we do need tooling like SAST to actually scan that code for us and then identify that, because it's you're right, it's unrealistic to try and do that manually.
So that plugs in really well to what we're talking about right here, right? So this idea of SAST and software quality and testing, again, I come back to those in the call like, well, this is a good informational webinar. Maybe I'm not a security person. Really, everybody's attention should be looking at this because, like you said, like last year, it was 40,000. This year, we're not even through the end of the year, and we're past 40,000 new CVEs. And AI is really one of the things, and we'll kind of show a metric around that, is perpetuating insecure coding patterns. We're generating more code than ever. The velocity is going up. And if you really don't have a strategy, you're not using SAST, or you're not even aware who's doing it, you're well behind the curve, right? The curve is moving very quickly. So, a couple of these areas that I look at around, how are we leveraging SAST and software quality and testing? I'm sure, John, you'll say the same thing. It's the same as you would if you're in development or in cloud engineering or site reliability. I mean, we should be building these tooling SAST early in the process. John's concept of safer software sooner, and we talked about shifting left, to proactively scan source and identify these vulnerabilities really early, right? I mean, like you said it earlier, John, like we don't even need to have a running application from a SaaS perspective to start scanning a code base, which is great. And it's free, meaning we don't have to have QA time reviewing code, going through and doing these things manually. We can automate it. We have some integrations that John and I will show, that we're recently offering for both Kiuwan, which is our Sembi security SaaS platform, and TestRail, which those of you in the test side either have used or are familiar with as a test management platform and integration kind of hub for automation and all things testing. In integrating these specifically in CI/CD and adding quality gates and really creating bugs and defects, not just for functional issues, but we can get a really great process to flag security vulnerabilities and get those into our defect triage and defect pipeline. So did that kind of touch on it, John? I mean, this is really the core of what you were just talking about for DevSecOps. This is like the testing in the middle of the DevSecOps diagram, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And to your point, it's adding those security gates, because it's really, we cannot be manually combing through our code base and trying to find these things. By simply adding a security gate fits into our CI/CD. The tooling will let us know if something is not right about this deliverable. So yeah, that's the key point there.
So we're going to kind of transition. So, Thank you, John. Talk a lot about, this idea of like, what does SAST really mean? What is security? And really this idea of even DevSecOps, if you're not familiar, how does all this, kind of come together? We looked at some metrics, different roles or people that are focused on doing security testing, or maybe no one, right? Based on that one survey, a lot of people don't have a dedicated role. And we now know why it's really important. We looked at all these issues and, we kind of have the stage set of like, where's this going now? And as part of the title for this webinar, and we didn't just plug it into just to add, AI something. That's the trend nowadays, right? Everybody's talking about AI, but it's important around what we're doing to realize. And as John said too, with the number of CVEs, we've more than, we're going to well exceed what we had last year for new vulnerabilities. And the bigger question is, right, is AI really making this better or worse, right? We're developing code more rapidly, faster, easier. We have AI assistants, plugins, ChatGPT, Claude, all these different things that people are using. And is it making it better or worse? And Veracode is a large, player right now in the security space as a vendor. And they just came out. This is from July 2025 from SD Times. It's a really credible source. They have a lot of great content. Basically said that, you know, nearly half, I think it's like 48% or something in this article. There's a link here if you want to go and read it. Now AI generated code is injecting almost half security risks in these development tasks injected or originated in directly AI, right? So for what John said aligns, right? What you're seeing in the CVE volume, does this surprise you, John? I mean, like I know you were talking about that before. Are CVE volumes going up? Things are really ramping up. How wide is this happening? It's
Yeah,
not surprising, right?
not surprising at all. AI generated code is flawed. It's trained on public-facing code bases that contain security vulnerabilities. We're still subject to hallucinations. We haven't quite figured that out totally. And it doesn't have context. And so if I'm Joe Coder and I'm writing code and I say, hey, can you help me generate this code for my API and better do some CRUD operation, blah, blah, blah. It spits out 100 lines of code for me. And that code has a SQL injection vulnerability, or it has a cross-site scripting vulnerability, or there's cyclomatic complexity if it has to do a mathematically intense algorithm and that cyclomatic complexity is high. I'm willing to bet my next paycheck that none of those developers are going back and saying, oh, hey, sorry, Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, there is a cross-site scripting vulnerability on this line 5. Can you please correct it and give me new code? They're going to accept that code lock, stock, and barrel. So the only way that this code is going to get better is if the code is continuously trained, and the code that gets accepted, it gets spit out, instead of just being accepted as it is looked at through the lens of, hey, there's a security vulnerability, there's a code flaw in this. This is a maintainability issue. And then give me something else and refine it. That's the way. The only way it's going to get better is if it gets refined. It's only as good as the people and the input, the people with the knowledge and the context. Furthermore, if I ask it for, like we talked about earlier in the threat modeling, code that is going to run in a mobile app is different than code that's going to run in your API. So there's different things to consider, like how am I storing my data? How am I transmitting the data? If I store this in an XML file and it's a client side, it's on my customer's desktop, well, then that's different than if it's just on the server side, it's in the cloud. There's different things to think about. There's different contextual things. And if we're just accepting code, like in isolation, it's not necessarily going to take all that into account. So, and again, we've seen this. We've seen it where, companies have, gotten rid of human developers in favor of AI, and they've run into issues in production, and it's not surprising. None of this is surprising to me. I think we're a little too eager to accept it because it will spit out code, but we're not being critical enough of the code that's coming from the AI engine, be it Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, wherever it's coming from. We're just not looking at it as critically. And if we are looking at it critically, we're not looking at it in terms of, is this code going to be performant? What are the, like I said, the security vulnerabilities? Oh, I found one that you gave me. I'm correcting you. And I'm correcting you, Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, please give me different code. That is what's not happening. So that's why we're running into these issues.
Yeah, and I think this is really good, and this is really a great, point for us to kind of pivot of like, what can we really do about this? You have all this background, John's given us some great insights. I talked a little bit and really this idea of now unifying this with testing, and I think everybody on the webinar today is like, well, Chris, like, how do we do this actually? So there's really two different approaches, right? We'll talk really briefly. I'll go through this about our process approach, and then I'll look at our tech stack and tooling. And John and I have a short demo we prepared, and then we'll kind of do some key takeaways, and then we'll open it up for questions. I want to make sure we have enough time. But it really starts here in this process approach from the software quality perspective. Again, I know a lot of you likely are coming from the QA, QE, test engineering side, is having a unified testing strategy that treats security findings actually as real bugs, right? If you're not going to treat a vulnerability as a defect, triage it, treat it as a real issue. That's really a heart of a process thing. Doesn't matter where it's come from, the tooling. We'll get into that in a minute. But you have to have a unified kind of strategy that treats security vulnerabilities in the same way you would bugs, with priority. Maybe have a good defect triage meeting with your product or leadership, get the developers involved. This is really the start of getting some momentum with that. The second area here for those really that are looking and using test management in a tooling perspective is we should be integrating and leveraging this with known tooling that we have now both optimized and integrated, and test management is really a big part of that, right? If you're not really leveraging test management from a platform perspective, integrate your manual, your automated test, and now we're factoring in security, right? How do you now bring all this together? So prioritizing these vulnerabilities, aligning them with your defects in your triage process, right? Bringing them inside the test management. So connecting and integrating, and the screenshots that John and I have here show Kiuwan at the bottom and now how this now integrates directly with TestRail. You start to get some synergy where we have the integration of the results coming out of your SAST findings. Your SAST findings are really doing this at what I call here automation at scale, meaning every time we do a build, a check-in, like John said, you don't have to have a finished product to run this. Every time code is merged or updated, even early in the dev cycle, even if they're stubbing out or building framework components, we can be running SAST scanning, leveraging that, integrating the results and defining our thresholds for what's acceptable. And again, John will show a little bit what Kiuwan's doing on how to do that from a tool perspective. And then that can actually get into our test management platform to give a full picture of how does this now impact quality? How are we trending? Where are we falling short? And that gives us really great data now as a holistic view. And it's kind of my last bullet here is improved compliance and reporting. Like, what was our trend or bug defect rate last release around security findings versus functional or automated testing? How does that impact release quality? Or if we had to release right now, what percentage of test failures align to security and what is the priority or risk of those? These are the things we can start to build if we leverage the integration of tooling and process, getting this into test management, unifying it with our SAST tool. So we'll go through and show you more of these, but this is how we really shift left and get this momentum for what John and I have been talking about. So with that said, we're going to jump into a demo. We don't normally do these with all these webinars, but this is like a real kind of hands-on portion that John and I wanted to do. John, I'll hand it over to you to talk about how are we actually doing this in Kiuwan for those in the call that have not actually seen like what SAST scanning looks like or how we can achieve this with some thresholds. And then I'll talk about integration of this with TestRail.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so the Kiuwan platform, it gives us control over app security, code quality, and software supply chain security. With our Kiuwan-TestRail integration, we've focused around audits and checkpoints. And basically, an audit is it evaluates if the results of a application delivery analysis will satisfy a predefined set of conditions known as checkpoints. So here's our audit and here's our checkpoints. And then based on the results of that evaluation, an audit will pass or fail our build. These audits are triggered by our CI/CD, and the test executions, or excuse me, the scan will create a test execution with corresponding corresponding test executions over on the test rail side, which we can then use to make our test plans, etc. So in this particular audit, it has failed, and we have a couple of different checkpoints. We had a threshold of 100% that we would have had to hit. Again, all this is configurable, but we hit about 87%. One of the checkpoints passed and one failed. And then from the Kiuwan side, we could see we have a checkpoint called threshold for total maximum number of defects for specific rules. So this is as general or as broad as it can get, but we have a set number of rules that we selected. And then if we have greater than 44 that get triggered within this, that will cause this checkpoint to fail.
So real quick, John, and I want to make sure we have enough time for some questions around this, but I think the one thing everybody may be asking, right, is what is this really? This basically is giving us the option from whether you're in the security space or not, we're basically setting a test. This is essentially a test of whether we're passing or failing a given defined criteria for security. Like, are we above or below? Are we passing or failing this attribute of security? Of all the stuff that you talked about, right? This could have any number of findings. I'm just kind of like relating this to those that are on the call from the QA or test background. These are essentially defining our test thresholds for all these vulnerabilities that could come up that you mentioned previously, right?
Yeah, 100%. These are so I'll show you in a second here, but like these are very generic, but the idea is total number of defects for specific rules. That doesn't really mean anything, but in a second here, what if we wanted to relate this to OWASP? So for example, we can make these checkpoints. Hey, if I have a new defect that relates to one of the OWASP top 10, fail my build, fail it right there. And then those tests will correspond to it. If I'm handling payment processing, I can make sure that anything that applies to PCI DSS, if I have one new vulnerability that comes from that, fail my build. So the idea is we can configure this integration to work more consistently with the type of app that we're building, or it can be more general. We can take it out of the box. And then from the Kiuwan side, again, just to kind of tie a bow on it, we get all the individual failures. So for example, I need to define a virtual constructor in every base class. I get the exact files to which this applies. I could drill down to the exact line number. Kiuwan gives me the line number, and then I can get details, description of this issue. So let's say I'm not a C++ developer. Well, okay, I need to avoid base classes without virtual deconstructors. Classes will typically hold a pointer to the base class, not a pointer to the concrete implementation. So I get a full description right there in plain language, and I get a sample of violation code. This is not my code. We're not we're not uploading the full source code to Kiuwan. We don't want to house your code, but we have samples of what violation code and what fixed code would look like. So boom, all I have to do is add myself a destructor right there, and then I fix this issue. It's been remediated. So whether or not I want to get into all those details, whether or not I want to know, hey, there's a cross-site scripting or SQL injection, whether or not I want to know that in my role, that's up to you. But all the information is there, and I'll even get all the vulnerabilities and exploits. Just to kind of finish this out, again, this is very generic. If I want to, and I'm a power user of the integration, I have the ability to configure audits and checkpoints. So let's say I wanted to create a checkpoint that was related to, like we said, OWASP top 10. For example, there's all these different rules and issues and vulnerabilities. I could set a rule where I'm only selecting OWASP related issues and only related to Java. And then I could apply those, and I could create my own checkpoints. So then I'll see things like CSRF and XML injection, cross-site scripting. So again, we have the ability to configure this tool exactly to fit our use case. So maybe I'm more of a Java, maybe I'm more interested in mobile, maybe I'm more interested in Java, maybe I'm interested in a certain stack or Spring Boot. There are rules that will be specific to that. I have full control over this, and I can configure it within the tool. And then again, we can identify and remediate those security vulnerabilities well before deploying to production.
No, this is really good, John. And so really what it sounds like, and it's a good transition point, right? We can use Kiuwan as a SAST tool, specifically the way that we can design this integration, where even if I'm not really a specialist or an expert, like I don't consider myself an expert in security, like John has a lot of deep domain knowledge, but I can configure this against the OWASP top 10 and really set these rules that are going to pass and fail, right? For this criteria to maintain a quality standard for security, for us to start getting some automation to actually flag these, whether they're going to be an issue for my team. And the question is, well, now what do we do with that, right? So I'm showing TestRail right now. For those that are TestRail users, this will look familiar, but I've executed here in my, let me just exit out of that. I've executed here in a GitHub action an integration of Kiuwan, right? So if those that are familiar with CI/CD, like I've run this in a GitHub action. This could have been triggered in a pull request, could have been triggered manually. Where I'm running, these are just my steps. Kiuwan SAST scan, and I'm going and getting our last scan and run code, and I'm basically using our TestRail CLI. For those that are familiar with TestRail CLI, it's our integration, Python-based integration command line tool that takes the output of the Kiuwan scan that John just showed, and it's porting it to a JUnit XML file and generating and creating our test entities in TestRail automatically based on how we defined it in Kiuwan, these pass-fail thresholds. So we went from a Kiuwan scan, a SAST scan of security vulnerabilities based on how we've configured it, to now showing how we're going to now integrate this directly into TestRail. So the value here, and I think it's really important to now see how we're unifying. I have now a new test run inside of TestRail that aligns with maybe my regression testing, my functional testing. Maybe I'm doing other types of functional QA or non-functional testing, maybe running some performance tests. But I now have dedicated runs that aggregate in TestRail, my test management platform, that show me now pass-fail criteria. So it's really interesting here. For example, this is the example that John showed, like threshold for maximum defects for a given role or issue. I can now use this. There's the threshold. We know it failed. Maybe I want to go and create like a new defect here if I'm, say, a Jira user. I can now go and create a brand new bug, like I'm creating and pushing one in Jira, tied to this test failure. Here's my new Jira ID. And now, as part of this new test case, which has been created based on a security finding, I now have a brand new Jira issue that we can then go and actually demo. And we can triage it. We can show our developers, and we have a path to remediation, right? So this gives us a lot of power of not just scanning and creating a report. It's scanning, reporting, defining thresholds, and then now aggregating and combining this with our test management and how we look at release and release quality. Really brings this concept together of quality through security. So with that said, I want to shift back. And so just like every TestRail and even Sembi webinar that I've done and John and I've done together, we talk about really continuous improvement and really what are some things you should be doing. I'm not going to go through each one of these. I want to make sure we have time for questions, but as a high level, you should be conducting self-assessments on these processes, right? If you're having security vulnerabilities, findings, you're running into problems, or even maybe just a takeaway from this webinar, what are we currently doing? Assess your current process and really identify if we're having issues, where are they? And if I have tooling or I don't even have tooling, what do we need to do to bridge some of the gaps and some of the things that I'm mentioning? And I think more importantly, what John's mentioning from a security side, to get security considerations as part of your quality testing and overall SDLC process. So we'll touch on key takeaways really quickly, and then we'll turn it over for questions. One of the big things here is quality and security are unified. I think that's something that, John has really mentioned, which I think it's interesting coming from more the software test and quality background, that security is not something that somebody else is doing. And actually, based on our survey, a lot of people don't even have a dedicated role to address that, which is really frightening. So quality and security are unified, and QA and testers have a great mindset for this. So it really should be something we're thinking about together. Integrating SAST, specifically SAST, with the testing stack, because this is something that John mentioned too, that we don't have to have a fully built out product at the end to have this happen. We can be running this on day one as code is developed and deployed. And this really leads into the next one, where vulnerabilities should be bugs. I actually just did one real time. For those that are familiar with TestRail, even if not, you just saw we had went from a security finding and a threshold check that John set inside a Kiuwan and a SAST scan. And then I went into TestRail, created a test case automatically with our integration, and I was able to create a new bug on a vulnerability or group of vulnerabilities for a threshold we defined inside of our SAST tooling. So we should be able to do this fluently and track these things. We should be able to also execute these in pipelines and deeply embed them. And I just showed you a brief snippet of our GitHub integration and how we can be generated from pipelines. And I think the biggest thing in the end here, and again, both of John and I talked about this, is AI code really requires extra vigilance. It's moving the needle faster and less secure than anybody really, I think, realizes. So it's something we got to really think about in terms of what and how we're doing, and how are we going to set our software quality strategy up to be successful, keeping in mind security should be a part of it. So I think that's all we have for the webinar today. Let's definitely go to some Q&A. Haley, I'll open it up for any questions.
Yeah, we've just got one that's come in, and I think it might be a fairly easy one to answer. The question is, what is the data set size from which you calculated the 50% of AI code is flawed metric? Which I think this might be referring to the SD Times article. So Hamza, who asked that, the link to that article will be shared with the resources when we email out the webinar.
Yeah, and I think just I won't answer that directly. We didn't do the survey, but I will say that it was a survey driven on a fairly large sample size by Veracode. But yeah, the resource will be there. It's a pretty credible SD Times, very credible publication. So definitely take a look if you're interested.
We've just got probably time for one more. So a question from Christopher. Do you have any suggestions on how to prompt TestRail AI, which is awesome, to help me with no security testing background to create those critical key one checkpoints, or do you recommend just working off the OWASP top 10?
Yeah, so I'll respond to this coming from the TestRail side. So Christopher, I've done some demos, and if you send a note either through this webinar, I'm happy to do follow-up on the TestRail side. TestRail AI code-based generation for test cases right now, already based on the context, will factor in security considerations like at a login screen, DOS, or vulnerability SQL injection patterns. So our AI engine, Sembi IQ engine, will factor in security vulnerability considerations based on certain context. You can use that or leverage that with your Kiuwan SAST integration, which we have fully documented. So it can augment it or it can complement it. But security-based testing with TestRail AI is something that it'll give you. Work with the prompts. Hopefully that was helpful. We're happy to do any follow-ups on that too.
Just in the interest of time, we will be sharing out some resources. And thanks, Chris and John, for the great session today. We'll be sending a follow-up email within a couple of days with the webinar recording, including the Q&A. There are a few unanswered questions, so we'll try to make sure we can address that in the resource that we send to you. And with that, thank you for spending your Tuesday with us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Everybody. Thank you.